Yeah. When the kids starting, are they after or are they before holiday?
After,
Because some of the school districts they start doing it before.
right, September 3rd.
Because when I was on, everybody was like the second or third week of August.
Yeah,
So
I would too. Like I've got a lot of bunch of friends that already started.
yeah, it's not a bad thing.
I think I'd prefer, I think I'd like to September start.
Yeah,
Going later in June. Sometimes the weather in June is like, hey.
yeah. Well, I think the theory behind it was way back in the day. They started in August because they didn't want to go into the summer months when it started really hot because a lot of schools never had AC.
Oh, yeah.
So that was the premise,
Oh,
the premise of why they started doing what they did. And then obviously it's one of those, they do it and then everybody's like, oh, we're still doing it. But why are we still doing it? And it
Right.
never answers the question. So.
you're right.
Unless they didn't either.
Yeah, I think I will just say, if you want to move that one to last. Okay, more sense. Yeah, let me just. So just did a lot.
What I was prepared for.
Okay.
Charlotte, how are you?
How are you?
Good.
And then I'll just say-
Yeah, that's all that.
I'm glad I wore my story.
So we're gonna just have, yep, just back at one of the tables in the back. Does everybody feel situated? Ready?
Don't worry, everybody.
I call this August 20th, 2024 Finance and Operations Committee meeting to order. It is 11:03 a.m. Mr. Meyer,
Here.
Melissa Monroe. Welcome to our Finance and Operations Committee. We are going to go a little bit out of order of the agenda because we'll be discussing topic A later on today. So I will introduce our CFO, Mr. Scott Ecker. He will be starting off with our unaudited 2023-2024 year-end financials.
Hi, thank you. My name is Scott Ecker. I've been in the district about 2 months now. I started here July 1st. And I'm here to share both the 23-24 unaudited financials as well as a preliminary budget update for 24-25. I'm going to read my memo because I think that is probably more succinct and accurate than anything I can just come off saying. So, and I was very deliberate in how I wrote it. So I just want to, I'll pull it up here and I'd like to just read it. So the district's fiscal year runs July 1st to June 30th. We recently closed the books for 2023-24 and presented here as an assessment of our unaudited fiscal year 23-24 budget performance. The district will receive the final audit report in approximately October. So when our auditors complete it, which is normally October, November, which will then be presented to the board soon after receipt. I would not anticipate any material differences between this presentation and the final audited numbers. For our revenues, the general and special education funds, generally known as our operating funds, net of transfer, revenues were budgeted at $96,720,491 and finished at $99,092,314. This is a positive variance of $2,371,823. And most of the positive variance is due to ESSER funds, that positive variance was then also offset with offsetting ESSER expenses. So qualifying expenses allowed us to receive the additional revenues. On our expense side, for the general and special education funds, again, net of the transfer, expenses were budgeted at $103,847,404 and finished at $114,426,629. This is a negative variance of $10,579,225. Most of the negative expense variance were in salaries, benefits, and substitute teacher costs. On research, I found that the prior CFO budgeted a 7% increase for salaries and benefits. This would not have been enough to cover the approved salary and benefit increases as approved by the board. Additionally, overages occurred in building safety initiatives, COSA 2075 facilitation, legal and communication expenses. Our fund balance was budgeted to decrease from $35,749,695 to $28,622,782, a reduction of approximately $7.1 million. For the actual unaudited year end, the fund balance decreased from, again, the beginning of $35,749,695 to $20,415,380, a net reduction of $15,334,315, or $8,207,402 more than budget. My internal audit, and I expect the external audit to also verify this, shows that all, and I think this is very important, all expenditures, despite being over budget, were appropriate and approved by the board. Some of these overages could not have been foreseen. For instance, increased safety costs and legal costs. However, others simply appear to just not have been calculated correctly. Those would be things like our salary costs, benefit costs, and substitute costs. Simply put, the budget as presented to the board for approval a year ago, June of 23, was poorly built. Additionally, budget expenses were never updated or presented to the board, even after staffing and insurance costs were known in the fall. So a preliminary budget was built in June. Typically, a school district CFO would update the budget once we know final staffing, once we have student counts, and present a final approved budget to the board. As far as I can tell, this was not done. I'm entering my 25th year in the field. I've worked with over 100 school districts at this point in my career, part of those as a consultant, and this is the first time I've seen anything like this, where the CFO didn't present an updated budget at any point over 13 months. So I've been racking my brain I've been here 2 months now, for probably about 2.5 months. I've been racking my brain about how did this happen, or how could it happen? And the reason I say 2.5 months is I was given access to the financials by the prior CFO late May, early June. I looked at the financials. I contacted the prior CFO. I told him I had some concerns. Frankly, he refuted those concerns and did not agree with my assessment. I've also wondered, is there any way that someone could have known outside of him that we weren't tracking correctly? And what I did is I went back, and I'm going to share here. I went back and I looked at the monthly financial reports as presented by the prior CFO. And a couple of things stand out to me. The first is on the very top of the page, the report he was using, kind of, to me, if it's at the top of the page, means this is an important thing, talks about a material variance to the budget. And repeatedly, if we look at many committee reports, we're going to see that there was never a material variance to report as he presented. As I scroll further down, investigating, when we get to the numbers, This is on page 5. The final thing I found is he presented something that would show the original budget. Again, this is the budget that was approved, would have been approximately June of 23, I believe. So that was the budget. He would show the year-to-date actual. And then I believe this to be perhaps misleading. The balance to be received or expended, I would have expected this to be a projection of what he thought would still be spent over the course of the remainder of the year. Upon further investigation for each of the balance to be expended and received, this is simply a formula that says take the original budget, subtract what we've spent, and the remainder is the balance. That is not best practice. Best practice would show what we believe the actual expenditures to end at the end of the year. I don't know how anyone could look at this report and think that something wasn't going to end correctly. The way that it's presented, it says our budget is roughly 103 million. We've spent 64 million, and we anticipate spending another 39 million. To me, that says, if I were a board member or a community member, I would look at this and I'd say, hey, we're right on track. We're going to spend what our budget is. I don't know why it's presented this way, but this is how it was presented. Also attached to the memo are, I've just tried to simplify, the numbers in the graphical format. So the board and community can see prior years revenues and expenses at a level, and then what our original budget was, the preliminary budget again would sort of be a darker orange color, and where our actual unaudited numbers are sort of peach color. That concludes my report on 23.
Well, I'll make some comments. That we have two problems here. The second problem is what you are addressing today, as I understand this. The first problem is that we have budgeted deficit spent. And that is not what you're talking about today. The deficit spending was, what was the budget? I don't want to offhand say an incorrect number, but we were going to spend down fund balance by $7-some million. Is that correct, as I'm reading this?
Yeah, that's what I can see the board approved.
Right. Okay, all right. Now, the board approved that. Mike Meyer, me, I voted against the budget for the last 3 years. That is not what we're talking about here. We are talking about once that budget is approved, now we overspent and didn't know it. And that's another $8-some million. So as we're running out of money, we have two problems. We're budgeting to spend down our reserves, and now we have this second problem occur. The board, as soon as Scott was on the scene before he was fully employed here, Scott did sound the warning. Dr. Means handed a paper memo to me personally on June 11th that said we might have a problem here and it needed to be researched and confirmed, which is what you've done. In the July Finance Committee meeting, we spoke to that memo. We said we are researching this problem and the results would be confirmed one way or another and reported this month, which is exactly what you're doing. So this has been known to the board for 2 months. The superintendent and Scott have reported it to the board. We have discussed it in open meetings. And now the fear is confirmed that this is now what we have. The second problem our first problem, depending on how you look at it, we budgeted 2 deficits, and now our math was bad. And our spend down of reserves is double, so we run out of money sooner. And my question then is, when do we run out of fund balance that we have to start the short-term borrow if something doesn't change?
So for those not familiar with short-term borrowing, many school districts across the state short-term borrow. If you have enough money in your fund balance, even when you reach your low point of cash on hand, you can still pay all of your expenses. I would guess maybe half the school districts borrow money and half don't, ballpark. For those that do, there is a point of time, and that's because the state sends you your property taxes and your equalized aid, not in equal payments over 12 months, but in big chunks. So you go a good part of the year receiving very little revenue, but you're paying payroll, you're paying payables, I'm sorry. And then you get a big chunk of money in December and January that kind of refills your fund balance. We may have to look at cash flow borrowing this year, or taking a line of credit, which wouldn't be unusual statewide, but would be unusual
For us. So when you say this year, do you mean this calendar year or this budget year?
Yeah. Now that, I mean, well, they're kind of the same to me.
Okay, well, what month and what year would that possibly happen?
If we have to do it, it's gonna be December or January.
December 2024 or January 2025. We are facing possible short-term borrowing. And I'm in my 21st year on the board. We have never short-term borrowed in my 21 years on the board. And for quite a number of years before that, we did not short-term borrow. And that has been the financial practice of the school district, never to get ourselves into this spot. We are now in this spot where we may need to do this. Okay, thank you.
Anything else on agenda item C? We'll move on to agenda item D, the 2024-2025 budget update.
Okay, so, again, I'm going to read, I'm just trying to move something on my screen. Okay, great. So in accordance with best practice, when there's turnover in the business office, Ms. Hemmer Rolland and Dr. Means asked me to review the 24-25 budget that was created and presented by the prior CEO. Here's the findings. Our revenue limit items, so that is the bulk of our revenue, property taxes, state aid, and well, not technically revenue limit, but per pupil aid as determined by the state. That makes up about 81% of our district's general fund revenue. These items won't be finalized until after our third Friday, so we always have to make estimates on the number of students we have, which drives our total revenue cap. So that'll be finalized after our third Friday in September account. But this 81% of revenues appear to have been budgeted recently. So every district across the state is making projections on the revenue limit, and ours seem to have been done per best practice and reasonable. Our open enrollment will also be finalized after our third Friday account. That's all part of the same count. That appears to be reasonably budgeted. Our interest income and Medicaid revenue were both budgeted beyond what we could reasonably expect to receive. And so we will be reducing those to match what we expect to receive so that we're not overstating potential revenues. Our special education aid, there's some good news, was budgeted too low, so maybe too conservative. And so we have increased that so that it is in line with more accurate projections. And so the net general and special education funds, the net reduction in revenue is roughly, well, it's $392,871 from what the board approved in the preliminary budget. On the expense side, our salaries have been budgeted appropriately to match the staffing plan. So we went through every staff member, what they're going to be paid, what line item they're paid from, and we're able to reconcile the budget with all the staff members that we currently have. So that is, was budgeted for. Health insurance, it was communicated, so this is kind of tricky. It was communicated to the board and the cabinet that health insurance was budgeted with a 4% increase. So my predecessor, that's what he communicated. In reality, it was budgeted with an 11% decrease from the actual spending. So I think he would say that he put a 4% increase in of the 22-23 budget. Now, since that budget wasn't accurate, to have a 4% increase there really is immaterial. What we need to look at is what was our actual cost and what do we anticipate the cost to be in 24-25. So we've right-sized that to expect actually a 10% increase from our health insurance consultant. And this has left a budget gap of $2,304,000. Additionally, our substitute costs have gone up, and that's based primarily on it's based on fill rates and usage. So we have subs in the classrooms when we need them now, so we're very happy about that. But that was also underfunded based on our new data with fill rates by $1,472,000. So that has a net impact on the overall budget. The proposed budget that was presented to the board for adoption on May 29th, 2024, showed a fund balance expenditure of $9,377,475. Had the budget been built accurately, the document would have shown, so by accurately I mean had the revenues been projected the way they are now and the expenses projected the way they are now, would have shown a fund balance expenditure of $13,597,121. In my estimation, this was a $4,219,646 error in budget. So the budget was simply not built right. So understanding that spending an additional, as Mr. Meyer pointed out, we can spending down our fund balance, but spending an additional $4.2 million in fund balance is not prudent. The cabinet has worked to reduce the budget in several areas. So we want to shrink that gap. The kind of bullet points of the way that we propose in doing that is via health insurance premium payments by our employees, and we have talked about that kind of at length at open board meetings. We're going to minimize out of classroom time for teachers. That also means rearranging how we do professional development in large part to maximize time spent with kids and time spent on professional development for our teachers. There are several staff positions we're leaving unfilled. And then we also went through line by line and made some budget reduction by line. So these reductions will total $2,412,071. But then, so we had the original gap, right, of $4,219,646 as the error. We believe we can come up with this $2,412,071. And when we come forward for final budget approval, we'll be asking for an additional balance the budget, an additional $1,807,575 from the fund balance to balance it. So now, kind of getting to your question about this, where do we sit generally overall fund balance and how does this impact cash flow borrowing? The budget presented to the board in May anticipated a July 1st beginning fund balance of $28,622,942. We now know this was an inaccurate prediction. Our beginning of fund balance unaudited will be, unaudited again, but about $20,415,380. To balance the budget this year, we will need to use $11,185,475. And this will leave our fund balance at $9,230,329 at the end of this fiscal year, so June 30th, 2025. So maybe I'll pause there before moving through the rest of the analysis.
So are we looking at short-term borrowing at the end of 2025 as well then, if all things stay the same and there's no additional revenue.
If there's no additional revenue,
Yeah, I should qualify that, I mean, so the referendum in this November, operating referendum, if that passes, does that money arrive in time to eliminate the, I'm assuming if we need the short-term borrow this year, at the end of 2024, will we be in the same spot next year needing short-term borrow at the end of 2025? And what could get us out of that, needing the short-term borrow at the end of 2025?
oh, thanks for clarifying. So, and I think what I'd like to do over the next month, so part of our committee agenda next month could be looking at cash flow borrowing more in depth, so then I'll know precisely whether we're going to have to or not, because I'll assume we're going to have, okay, for the purpose of this conversation, but we'll know whether we have to or not by next month. I would anticipate if we have to for this year, we likely will have to for next year. Right. 25, 26. And we may have to do that until we build our fund balance back up. And we'll have to be disciplined in how we spend our funds to build our fund balance back up. So that we get to a point where we don't have capital.
So my understanding of the operating referendum is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that it is not an amount that would restore our fund balance. Or is that my recollection
Well,
correct? Or
it's certainly not an amount that would restore it in 1 year. Right, it's a referendum for about $16 million. We're gonna spend, 11-ish out of our fund balance this year. We're going to use that referendum for the purpose of keeping and retaining staff primarily. And that's gonna, to keep and retain our staff, it's gonna cost upwards of over $10 million. So even if we didn't spend any more money from the referendum, which we've told the community we will on curriculum and other things in the resolution, there isn't a way in 1 year that we could get the fund balance back.
so I'm trying to phrase this in terms that lay people will understand, and that's probably how I understand it as well. Even with the referendum passing, we are facing multiple years of short-term borrowing. Very possible.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But as we've discussed, you say if the referendum passes at the end of the 4 years of the referendum, that the fund balance then would be restored, it just takes.
So we have to be disciplined in our spending. We'd have to be committed to putting money back into our fund balance. Right. And we can build a plan that we stick to and get the fund balance back to that.
Okay, so I'm gonna be just coldly clear here. We have not been disciplined like that for the past 3-4 years. We have willingly spent down fund balance, and I've been on the 6-to-1, and I've been on the one end of the 6-to-1 votes. So to get back to a solid spot where we don't have to every year short-term borrow, we will have to change our ways. We'll cannot be different from what we've done past 3-4 years in order to rebuild the fund balance. Is that lay person plain or no?
I'm not sure what I haven't been here for 3
Okay,
years. so I'm
all
not
right,
sure
well,
what the question was.
you don't have to speak to the 3 years, I will speak to the 3 years, we've been spending down fund balance. And if we want to build it back up, well, we have to behave differently than what we've done recently. But you just said we did, we're gonna have to become, we will have to be disciplined in the future. And if we weren't disciplined in the past, and you're not making representations one way or another on that, we will have to change our ways. I believe we will have to change our ways. But also, the operating referendum is a 4-year referendum. It will, something needs to happen in 2028 then.
Mhm.
We either need another operating referendum or a substantial rescue from somewhere. perhaps the legislature, we don't know. So that is our future here. We need, in order to avoid, we have faced multiple years of short-term borrowing. In order to get out of that practice, we will have to be disciplined in our spending, build our fund balance. And we also need another referendum in 2028 or substantially more money from the legislature. Or we're gonna face another crossroads in 2028. That's my understanding. If I'm incorrect, please educate me.
You've been involved in it a long
Yeah.
time, you know what you're talking about. The only thing I would
Mhm.
is, when districts go to referendum,
Mhm.
they're, you know, rightfully so, the primary talk is what is that going to do to our taxes? Because it obviously has a direct impact on the taxes, and the referendum means the community gets to vote. Okay? When people talk about the state giving us some relief, giving us more money, it's very rare that the state has said, hey, we're just gonna give you more money for funds. More often what they say is, we're going to increase the revenue limit and allow the board to essentially increase taxes without referendum. So in most cases, whether it is a referendum or, as we say, relief from the state, the impact is generally on the property tax. So I just want to be clear that even if the state were to say, we're going to give you more money, that is sometimes how they package it. But for every district in the state, that also means, and the board's allowed to increase your taxes.
So from this chair where I sit, Mike Meyer, at this moment, I am not for or against the referendum in 2024 and 2028. I am not for or against more taxes at this moment from this chair. My objective here is that we communicate the situation to the public.
Mhm.
And so we have likely short-term borrowing December this year, January next year. Likely short-term borrowing December 2025 or thereabout. Our fund balance will not be sufficient to avoid short-term borrowing for probably at least a couple of years. In order to rebuild the fund balance to avoid short-term borrowing, we will have to change our spending practices. And if the referendum passes this year, operating referendum in November 2024, probably we need another operating referendum in 2028 of some sort, unless the levy limit increases, but either way, it's more taxes. Okay, if that's not clear from everybody, let me know. I'm not promoting it or opposing it. I just want to lay out what our situation is.
So I'd like to share my perspective on this conversation. So I don't see it as relief from the state. I see it as the state meeting their constitutional obligation to fund our schools, which they have not done, which is in the bigger picture why we're in this situation. And I think a lot of districts in our state are in this situation. So I want to not separate us from the rest of the state when we're having this conversation, because many districts in the state are already miles down the road from where we are in the catastrophe of public funding for our schools. Also, when we talk about the fund balance, those were investments that we had to make to our staff and students. The achievement and the behavioral issues, the improvement in both this year alone would not be possible without taking the money from the fund balance. So I want to be really careful when we're talking about these things. Yes, the fund balance is lower than we wanted it to be, but I want the community to know that those investments were for our teachers and direct impact on our students in the classroom. So I think it's important to frame in what the money is going to, and that the state legislature for now decades has underfunded our public schools to put us in this situation. So that's my perspective to where we are right If we're done on the two agenda items, I'd like to also share that I am disappointed with how we ended, this school year. I have sat in committee meetings as the chair for over 12 months. And every meeting was shown what Scott showed all of us in highlight, that there is no variance in the approved budget, no material variance in our approved budget. As finance chair, that tells me that we are spending according to budget. Also, anytime the board was given a vote on spending, I was assured that it would make us stay in budget. And when I say in budget, I have always said the goal of mine as finance chair was to end the 24-25 school year with 17% of our operating funds in the fund balance. That was a charge that I gave our CFO, that was a charge I gave our board, and that was a charge that I gave our superintendent. I was never told with any of the spending approvals this year that we would not end there at the end of 24-25. So I've been very disappointed since June 11th, when I received the memo that we may have overspent. I immediately met with Dr. Means on June 11th and had some explicit words to share with him because the memo was not near what I had seen in the previous 12 months. I also immediately met with Dr. Means and Mr. Ecker and asked that he go line item by line item to see where we can make cuts, because we had as a board just approved a preliminary 24-25 budget. He did that. I told him there needs to be cuts, obviously. So this committee is committed to making cuts that need to be made to shrink this gap. So I want that to also be clear. I also wanted to know how this could happen when the board and this committee and the community were receiving regular updates from our CFO. Dr. Means went with Scott right through the financials to try to see where these gaps came from. As Mr. Ecker said, it was primarily staff increases, increase in substitute teaching costs, and then some other miscellaneous expenses. Looking ahead, we've also developed a plan, and you'll see a little bit of that later in the meeting, for more transparency to the board, to this finance committee, and to the Wauwatosa community, because I think all of those parties deserve that. Scott has committed to showing us red flags immediately when he finds them. And he's also, you'll see his reports are much more transparent. And when I say that, I mean that they're also much more interpretable. They're easier for the community to understand, and they're easier for the board to understand. I just want to emphasize that what you've heard is that this wasn't nefarious spending. This wasn't spending on things that we should not have spent money on. It unfortunately was a budget put together poorly, and nobody knew that. So looking forward, I hope that Mr. Ecker will work on building our trust and the community's trust, that we are going to see budgets that are aligned with what we're actually going to spend. And then if we have to spend more than that, we are aware of that, and we can make adjustments to shrink that gap or not have a gap, ideally. So I really appreciate the work of Dr. Means and Mr. Ecker. I've been working with them and having lots of meetings with them to try to see how we can get to a place where the community and the board has trust in the administration again.
I want to say that this committee, both of us, have demonstrated that candor, straight talk, don't sugarcoat things. As soon as we knew about something, June 11th, it was openly stated in public meetings where we had public meetings. My little soapbox is I do wish that the newspapers and the media, that they were better funded, that they could cover our school board meetings. And I welcome the coverage we have today to bring a bright shining light on Wauwatosa School District operations. we've had that for so many years in the past, and I understand, just like we haven't had the money we wanted, you haven't had the money you wanted either, to do your job. And so, I think as a board member, the buck stops with us. We're in charge. We owe the community an apology, and from my chair, I apologize. This shouldn't have happened. It did. And we're doing our best to be truthful and honest, transparent about what we're facing. Why both of us think we got here. And I think there's truth in what both of us said. And there's truth in what we said about what we need to do to get out. So thank you for hearing me out.
Before we move on, if it's all right, I just want to talk about what the next steps are in the 24-25 process, so that we can just kind of round out that way. So, so the next steps would be, we have our third Friday count. That will give us what our true revenue cap is. We're still, although we're, Sarah assured me we're well ahead of where we've been years before as far as staffing, but we still are trying to finalize our staffing, although we're almost there. And we'll know our state aid on October 15th. So those are the big remaining pieces. What I have always done, and I think best practice then, is when I bring the recommended tax levy for certification, that will also include an updated budget for final approval as what I call final approved budget. And that's going to reflect what we talked about today more closely than the previous budget. So I just want to have it out there that is going to come to the board again for approval.
Monthly financial report.
So, and these items were sequenced this way purposely, recognizing the need to rebuild the community's trust. And just kind of in line with best practice and kind of the way I operate. I wanted to bring forward a board report, a monthly financial report, that fits what is generally considered best practice as far as transparency, and part of transparency is understanding. And so we talked about that at our last board meeting. On the board docs, there's a video about how to read the report, and we went through that at the last board meeting. And so each month you're going to see this new report. Also, as some checks and balances, we're using a separate software from Frontline Education that analyzes and uses an algorithm to predict what we're going to end. So that is a separate check and balance than we have. Additionally, we're going to be asking our finance director to also put together a projection so that she and I can triangulate before presenting to the board and make sure we're all on the same page. So that's what's going to be coming. This month, you'll see the report, but frankly, we're 1 month into the year, and so there isn't really much to report. If we were tracking really bad after 1 month, we'd really have a problem. Or if we're tracking really good, it's probably an anomaly and things are going to revert to me. So really today is just really talking about how to read the report, where we are. I think there is one thing that stands out, and this is how I intend on highlighting these things for the board. So to me, the thing that stands out, is our purchase services is tracking ahead of where I would anticipate. And we can see that quickly by the purple line being above the red line. I'm sorry, right here. The blue line being above the red line. So our projection is low, our current is high. When I look at this report, that tells me, hey, I need to dig into that particular area and see what's going on so I can report that to the committee. And what we have here is a timing issue. So, well, not an issue, but a timing anomaly. where we have finished some maintenance projects ahead of schedule, so then we paid the bill ahead of schedule, so in July, or normally we would have probably paid it in August, as well as buying some curricular materials in July, and in the past, we probably would have bought those in August. So we're going to see that purchase services will revert to the mean after probably 2 or 3 months. And what I really want to emphasize is while I'll present this every month, we really can start triangulating after about the first quarter of the fiscal year. For instance, right now, if someone were to look at this, or when you look at it, you'll see our top source of income to date is interest income. And our fourth source is student fees at $3,800. And this kind of just speaks to when our real revenues or significant revenues come from the state versus when they're local. And so in this case, these aren't the big buckets that happen in July. So right now we're seeing things that aren't the big buckets. Salaries for teachers haven't been paid. That won't start until the second payroll in August, and then we'll really have a handle on it by the end of September after 3 payrolls. And that's when we'll start seeing the patterns emerge that we would expect.
No comment.
Final item on today's agenda is a review of the finance and resource committee year at the plants. This is our accountability. Yeah.
I'm going to pull that up, okay? So I reformatted this a little bit from, I think last year was the first year the board or the committee had used something like this, if I'm.
I think about a year.
Okay. And frankly, I was having kind of a hard time understanding. There was like F's and B's and green and orange. And so I just wanted to streamline it so I knew what we were doing each month. And I broke it into 3 categories. Category 1 is an operations focus area. So the finance office oversees multiple areas of operations, buildings and grounds, recreation department, fiscal, technology. I should probably add in here food service, because that might be a valuable report to get as well. And so what I want to have is 2 times per year, each of those kind of leaders in that area has a chance to come and talk about their goals, their accomplishments, kind of how we're tracking. And that's been done in the past as well. But this highlights kind of when each area will be looking for. And I broke the other 2 major areas into budget planning and budget monitoring, because I think the 2 things, as we learned today, are very different. Budget planning, right, is how are we projecting next year's budget or even longer term? And then budget monitoring is, hey, how are we doing this year compared to where we thought we should? So I just broke those down into kind of the key areas. Things like, at some point, let's see, where do I have this one? If I were to look at this one, multi-year assumptions reviewed happens before the multi-year budget projection. So at that point, we'd be talking to the committee about, hey, I have to build a multi-year projection. Here's the assumptions that I anticipate using. How does the committee feel about that? So, our health insurance company tells us we should assume a 10% increase. I want to kind of just make it front and center. That's the projection we're using. And then from there, I can build the multi-year projection. So I tried to layer these things in, you can see sequence. And then budget monitoring is kind of what we just looked at today, as well as things like the voucher payment approval. And it's just my practice that anytime that we have a significant, well, a good example would be at our board meeting last, I guess it's this month still, early in the month, we had to give the board an emergency update on a boiler stack, for lack of a better term. But if we had time, that would be something I would have brought to the committee first to talk about, so that then the committee is informed before it goes to the board. So that would be an example of something I see as update on special spending, for instance.
I'll get an opportunity for our staff. Anyone, does anybody have any questions or comments? All right, our next finance committee will be on, sorry, it's different. It'll be on September 16th at 11 a.m. The time is 11:50 a.m. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Please,
Oh,
you want to approve the motion to approve?
okay, yep, all right, you're right. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes from July 25th, 2024?
I so move.
Second. Now it is 11:51. Can I have a motion? Oh, sorry, okay,
Yes,
we'll do that over. Approve the minutes from July 25th, 2024.
just a little, we need some levity here. Chairing these meetings is really hard. And I've been board president before, and it's easy when you're in that chair, you're air traffic controller for stuff, and this happens a lot. It's happened a lot to me, it's how it goes, so yes, I vote yes on the minutes, and
I also say yes. And then, motion to adjourn.
so moved,
Second.
yes,
And I
See,
yes as
yeah.
well.
okay.
We are adjourned. Thank you.
Yes.
So technically you could,
Yes.
because you're making a motion for a vote, or not.
To do
Oh, you're
it.
Board members, thank you. Every motion, the second. Parliamentarians. Yes. The will.
Hi, how are you?
How are you?
Good.
We're just gonna catch, a quick comment from you.
I have no comment.
Not at all.
No.
Even after everything that they disclosed as far as kind of, get everything back up to speed.
I can talk to you about that.
Okay,
Sure.
thank you.
Go respect. You. Every member of the body. Their emotions.
I know.
So it's like, somebody has to like approve it, and then you just like.
It'd be easier for a spot. From the public schools.
Yeah.
That's why we're gonna have board meetings. Also somebody else.
Okay.
So it's like somebody motion.
Right.
I regularly.
How's everything going, sir?
What's on the agenda.
Summer's finishing well.
Chair meeting.
Good, yeah.
Brandon.
Knock on wood, we still have some programs that are finishing, but
Good day.
already straight.
But typically you would have. three
Two dates already in, we have
members.
one more for non-resident.
We only have 7 before.
But yeah, things are good.
You know.
Diane and I are working on the file, but we're switching all of our stuff, hiring. We're trying to,
Yeah.
so we've been working through that, so hopefully September at some point, so that's been a big project. Outside of that, going pretty well.
Thanks for coming. See the best in the show. It's almost like that, we can make a movie about a committee of 2 people.
Yeah. But yeah.
Well, we all go on that, so what we learned that information.
I'm gonna go.
Never indicate.
It's something, right?
Work out in and then.
I'm gonna go have lunch at Let's Do Route or something now.
Strives to figure.
Have a good day, guys. Have a good day.
So I think with the issue of As a result of having a new.
So was I trained, what did I do?
On the situation, we are able to identify what we need to do to rebuild our.
MBA, political science,
Was
cross,
miscalculation.
JD. Yes, Michigan Law School. MBA.
Boy, I can't
It's
see
information systems analysis and design.
too much. Is that a result of? Again, I'm pleased that Mr. Ecker's here. I'm pleased that we have the right CFO here now, but it would be inappropriate for me to try to continue the law. Explanation as to why.
Although before I went into that as a CFO.
There's concerns on the community about the referendum, that those expected to go down, and maybe that it should be given and what's been, discovered here. What's your comments?
I think that's a great question. What I would say is that if the referendum is not passed, the situation that we're facing in terms of a budgetary situation would actually be exacerbated. It was mentioned by one of the board members, on the committee that, our issue, our deficit spending is part of the problem. Actually, if the state had funded our public schools appropriately, we would have never even had the issue of having to think about deficit spending. The 23-25 state budget was so grossly underfunding public schools that we told our board then, that we had to spend our fund balance to ensure that we were able to continue the academic and behavioral improvements that we've seen in our schools. So we can't forget that we landed here in the first place because the state legislature hasn't funded the public schools appropriately with the 23-25 state budget. So going back to your conversation or your question around the referendum, if the referendum, the operational referendum is not successful, it will just exacerbate our budgetary situation. There will be massive cuts that we would have to implement. And any progress that we make, academically and with behavioral situations would actually diminish and should fall back. So sure, I think any community member can make the decision to not pass the operational referendum. Then we all need to understand clearly that then there will be massive reductions and cuts that would have to be implemented just.
Around the time that you discovered these issues.
That was June 11th, yes. And then let me back up and say this. As our current CFO and our past CFO were transitioning with one another, they were having conversations about what Mr. Ecker saw versus what was budgeted. And I think it was shared in this meeting today. There was disagreement with how things were progressing.
So I retired.
Now, Mr. Eckers had a chance and time to dig into the budget. This is his analysis, and this is what we believe we need to do moving forward.
So at the time that these
Lawyers retire,
issues rose
to have fun. I remember
you. So around the same time.
I'm trying.
Similar issues on this. Sure. Huge deficit.
So as a hobby,
At least. Or less become a very. So,
I had advocated for yes, different crisis.
How is this different?
So, Bill, I think that
The child.
it's extremely different.
I wanna
To try to group the situation in Wauwatosa schools and what you just heard today is night and day. They're very, very different situations. I appreciate you raising that question. The issue with Wauwatosa schools is about reporting to the Department of Public Instruction, and that those reports were not being submitted in a timely manner. So the question of what Milwaukee Public Schools face and what we are dealing with are two very different issues, and they should not be placed in the same category.
Then looking forward, it seems that there isn't. You know, sort of social functions further to make up this area.
Well, as Mr. Ecker shared, about half the state does short-term borrowing now. I think to be in a situation of a school district where you don't short-term borrow is a very good position to be in. But it is the norm in many school districts to short-term borrow. It's not an indication that you're in a bad financial position if you do short-term borrow. It's just that traditionally in Wauwatosa we have. So I want to be very careful. I think it was presented as if short-term borrow, that's a bad thing for a school system. That's not accurate. That's not accurate in any way, shape, or form. In fact, most school districts, about half this, I shouldn't say most, about half the school districts in the state, they short-term borrow right now. That doesn't mean that they're in a bad financial situation. It's just that that's their financial position. It's just different from Wauwatosa.
So.
And
that's the
so
subtlety
we
of-
need to be careful with our language and not be inflammatory about certain things.
So.
This situation here is
There's some
unfortunate.
guardians ad litem.
We had a miscalculation with the budget. But
York County.
the start of it, we can't ignore how it started. It started because in June of 2023, when the 23-25 state budget was
And they
passed,
say, well.
we shared in this board
School district.
that we would have to utilize our fund balance. We said that on the front end because the state budget did not fund public schools appropriately. And we had a decision. We could have either said, we're gonna use our fund balance and sustain the progress we're making as a school system, or we could start making massive cuts with the 23-24 school year. We could have done that as well. The community, the board, our administrative team said, that's not the direction we wanted to go. So the issue of deficit spending is something that we all had our arms wrapped around and understood that that's what we were going to do for the 23-24, 24-25 school year. We knew that.
What you didn't know was that there would be.
Correct. And yes, the miscalculation, that's unfortunate. We're all upset about, that situation and we're rectifying. But let's start with the foundation. And the foundation is, we knew from the beginning that we were going to have to utilize our fund balance. We knew that we had a healthy fund balance. In fact, some would make the argument that our fund balance was actually unhealthy. We had a fund balance that was nearly 40-45% of our operating budget. That's too much. So we had grown our fund balance to a point where it was appropriate to spend it down. And so I think, so again, some of the language that has been used to describe the situation, this is not what we've seen in other school districts in the metropolitan area. This is not an issue of malfeasance or something being done wrong. In terms of everything was appropriately approved. This is just simply from a calculation standpoint, there was a miscalculation made. From a budgeting standpoint, I think the upside to this is that we have a CFO now that could recognize it as he was transitioning in and alerted us immediately. And when I became aware of it, I alerted the board right away.
What was your initial reaction to finding out, not that there was a calculation, but it was calculation by millions of dollars?
Well, we have a $100 million budget. And so, it is, we deal with large amounts of dollars when we're dealing with an operating budget of our little. Just explaining to you, any miscalculation. There shouldn't be this.
My oldest one, I think.
And that's just
Get more
disappointing.
degrees that.
We had.
We're very.
Even steps for transparency is more, so that's the accelerator, everything you all receive.
There should always be transparency in terms of how you're dealing with the federal money. And how you,
Yeah, also very good.
we're always trying to improve. So again, and it's not as if we were being, we were trying to conceal something in the past. And so again, this is what I mean about our language and ensuring that we're not inflammatory with our language. I don't think there was any,
You wouldn't know unless you're in.
to conceal anything. I think there was legitimately a miscalculation, a misstep that was made. It's unfortunate because you're dealing with a certain dollar amount.
So I tried to make
But
clear
it's
that there were
unfortunate.
two issues here.
We are-
But
we're now aware of it.
we're not talking about the first one. The second one, which is everybody.
I would say this.
First.
School finance is something that everyone should do.
Yeah.
Of course. And we've always tried to be as prudent with the public dollars as possible. But we cannot ignore that the foundational entry point of having this conversation is that we knew we were going to deficit spend because of the 23-25 state budget. We knew that. And that's because
Good job.
the state underfunded public
Being on
schools.
top.
And this community said, we don't want
I'm
to
the-
see
what
massive
situation,
cuts.
yeah.
So the community said, going into the 23-24, and the 24-25 school year, continue the pattern of success you're having. Continue to make sure that you have low class schools. Continue to make sure that we have all the resources we need for our children.
Somebody else needs that, well,
If we had not utilized our fund balance, there would have been massive cuts.
I apologize.
We would have continued to lose teachers. We would have continued to not pay them. That's the edge that we can't ignore. So as we talk about these different things, the flip side in the beginning of it is that 23-25 state budget.